Hello everybody, I'm Kat Hewson. I work at the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute in Northern Ireland, and I work on the GrassCheckGB project. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be focusing on reseeding methods and mixtures. Just to give you a very brief overview of the GrassCheckGB project for anyone who isn't too familiar with it or might not have come across our weekly bulletins, I'm going to kick us off with just a bit of an introduction to the project and an update on some of the data we've been seeing so far in the 2020 grazing season. So GrassCheckGB started in 2019. It's a project involving 50 dairy, beef and sheep farms spread across the whole of GB. And within that group of farms, we've got quite a diverse mix of systems. So we've got people running organic, low input and conventional systems. And we've also got farms with quite a spread of upland and lowland locations, so quite a diversity of grassland production potential within the group. Our GrassCheck farmers are measuring grass growth weekly and inputting the data through AgriNet for us. They also provide regular grass quality samples, and all of the farms have on-site weather stations which are recording both weather conditions and additional soil data with soil temperature and moisture probes that are fitted. So we collate all of this data that's coming in from the farms every week, and we publish it in the GrassCheckGB bulletins. And you can find those in the Farmer's Guardian up in Scotland. They're in Scottish Farmer as well, and they're also published on our website and on our Twitter feed, where you can read a little bit more about our project. Up on my next slide, I've just got a few figures for you from the 2020 grazing season so far. So on the top left is the grass growth curve from March to May this year compared to the figures we recorded in 2019 for the same period. And as you see at the moment, and as you've probably seen if you've walked your pastures over the last few months, grass growth is well below average at the moment. And typically at the end of May, very start of June, we'd be seeing figures of 64 kilogram dry matter per hectare per day growth rates. That was up at 69 this time last year, but overall across GB, the average on the 1st of May was just 43 kilograms, so only seeing about 2/3 of expected growth through the late springtime. We've got a breakdown of current growth rates by region on the map on the right-hand side of this slide, and that's something that gets updated every week in our bulletins and online. But I think sort of the standout from the grass growth curve that I wanted to highlight to you is just the impacts of the low growth that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, and also the really slow start we saw to this season after all of that really heavy rain in March. Both of those factors are being reflected in the average yields that we've recorded this year to date. So the bar graph in the bottom left-hand corner, typically we'd be seeing about 3.8 tonne of grass dry matter grown between March and May across grazing platforms on GB farms. So that doesn't include anything that's been put aside for silage. In 2019, our GrassCheckGB farms averaged 3.9 tonne in that period, and this year we're over a tonne behind at 2.8 tonne. So there's quite a bit of variation by region and within and between individual farms with those figures. But just to take the south of England region, where they've got yields that are much closer to average at the moment, the driving factor behind that is really some very good grass growth that we had on farms in that area in April, and particularly a cluster of dairy farms that we have in the south of England that saw some very good growth in April. At the end of May, growth rates in the south of England were actually sitting at just 40.7 kilogram dry matter per hectare per day. So grass growth with the drought through May has been struggling just as it has been across the rest of GB this year. As I've said, we have the on-farm weather stations across the GrassCheckGB network, and looking at the data that's come in from those so far this year, the rainfall figures we have for May were averaging just 16.5 millimetres across all of our GrassCheckGB farms. Now, the typical long-term average rainfall from the Met Office figures, so this is a 30-year average from 1981 to 2010, would be 70 millimetres through May. So overall, we've seen just 24% of typical May rainfall. But again, varying quite a lot by farm and by region, and who's been lucky enough to see showers and who hasn't. The south of England, that figure was just 10% of what they'd expect. Wales, 14%. Scotland faring a little bit better with 43% of typical rainfall. And that's one of the reasons behind seeing slightly higher growth rates in the Scotland region over the last couple of weeks than we have in other areas. The bottom of the table, I've got a comparison of the average monthly soil moisture readings for our farms across GB in May this year compared to last year. And just to give you a little bit more detail on the soil moisture readings, this data is measured on a scale from 0 to 200, and we have probes in the soils on the farms which measure soil moisture tension. So the higher the reading is, the harder it is for water to be moved from the soil and taken up by the grass roots. So the higher the reading, the drier the soil conditions are. Readings from 0 to 10 would indicate really saturated soils, and that's certainly what we were seeing early on in March after all that rainfall. Figures of around 20 to 30 are probably about ideal. It does vary a little bit depending on your soil type. But once we get up past a reading of about 60 centibars on that scale, we do start to see there is a potential for growth to be restricted by the soil moisture deficit. And we did see that relationship in the soil moisture and grass growth readings last summer when we had some quite hot and dry conditions for a few weeks then. There's a table as a bit of a guide to the interpretation of these readings on Twitter too. But just to really highlight to you the extremely dry figures we've seen through May 2020, we're seeing readings sort of up and above 150, and on some farms they're topping the scale with bone dry soils at 200 centibars. It's really those factors that have been sort of dragging down grass growth rates over the past month or so, and that soil moisture deficit's been having a significant impact. The probes where we're taking these readings from, they're buried about 6 inches down in the soil, so they're taking a reading from the bulk of the shallower grass roots, and they're taking continuous readings and feeding those back to us online. My final slide that I've got to show you is just a few screenshots from the GrassCheckGB website. So I'd really encourage anyone who's interested just to take a quick look at the website. There is some more detailed and local grass growth and quality information available through the interactive map we have with all of our farms listed. We've got live weather data feeds there as well, and an average table with grass growth and quality data that's updated every week. But that is everything from me. Any further questions on the project, you can find contact details on our website, or you can get in touch through Twitter. And without further ado, I just want to hand over to Helen Mathieu for our feature presentation on today.
Thank you very much, Kat. Yes, my name's Helen Mathieu. I've been working as a forage production and grassland management specialist for, well, most part of 30 years, the last 15 of which as an area manager for the grass and forage seed specialist Germinal, working very much at ground level with farmers. And thank you very much for listening tonight. It's great to be involved with the project and the webinar tonight, and helping build the discussions going forward with farmers, trying to overcome some of the issues that we know you're all facing. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about the costs and the benefits, and then later on I'll be looking at the different methods and mixtures available. So reseeding and productivity from grass are acknowledged as the key contributors to farm profitability. We've had a couple of very tough years in terms of the fluctuating weather conditions, and from the sort of droughts of 2018 and a really difficult autumn last year in 2019. So understandably, people have a great deal of concern, and there is uncertainty at the moment as to, you know, how easy it would be to get a successful reseed. But really, the conditions aren't really an opportunity not to reseed. They're really reasons to focus on how we're going to do it. Not reseeding is going to be a completely false economy. So grassland reseeding offers us one of the best returns on investment available to livestock farmers. Grazed grass is always going to be the cheapest feed, and grass silage will be among the cheapest winter feeds that you can possibly produce. So the financial cost of the loss in production and the nitrogen use efficiency in some of the older lays can rise to several £100 very, very easily. Now, pastures with higher perennial ryegrass content will have an improved response to nutrients. So those older swards containing the indigenous species, meadowgrasses, Yorkshire fog and bents and so on, they're far less productive, they're poorer quality, and they're less responsive to nitrogen and improved soil fertility. The nitrogen may, of course, come from an opportunity to add clover to the lays. And of course, it's also an opportunity to tackle weeds and any soil issues. It's an opportunity to introduce modern varieties and improve your pasture response to nutrients. So just looking at the costs of reseeding, first of all, clearly sprays and spraying will not apply to everybody, but cost of the sprays could be for glyphosate, and then post-emergence sprays perhaps, and then the cost of spraying, that might amount collectively to £45 per hectare. Ploughing, again, not everybody will need to plough. Some people will use some of the more modern drills to get a very good seedbed for grass seed, but there's a cost in there for ploughing in this instance. And rolling, we may be rolling several times, of course. We've got the cost of drilling or sowing, around £45 a hectare in this instance. Fertiliser normally would be just P and K. Lime, we wouldn't really consider it as a reseeding cost, because if you need to lime, you should be liming anyway. We've put a cost in there for it. And then the cost of the seed. So a good sort of longer term lay, 14-15 kilos per acre, we would expect that to come around to that sort of 70 odd pound per bag at the moment. So your total reseeding cost will be around £440. Somewhere around that sort of figure is what we get, and those figures do agree with what specified on the website for the National Agricultural Association of Agricultural Contractors. Those are very much the averages, in line with their averages. So if we think that's around 440 odd pounds, and you see you've got the percentage contribution to the cost of all the different operations, including the cost of the seed there. We look about the benefits of reseeding, or what the output from new grass lays could be, or generally is. So typically we would see in a new lay, in its first full year of production, at least 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. Those are the sorts of numbers that we get quoted. That's what we see through the recommended list testing system. Now, if that new lay is producing around 13 tonnes of dry matter, we're going to get an average ME. So that's the D value multiplied by 0.16, average ME of around 12 megajoules per kg of dry matter. That gives us a total ME per hectare of 156,000 megajoules per hectare. An older lay, typically a lay that's say 3 years old, maybe 4 years old, we get a reduction in yield down to around 9.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. And then a slight reduction in D value, ME, to 11.3. And you can see we've got an ME there of 107,000, just over 107,000. So we've got a difference between those two lays of around 48,000 megajoules of energy. So dividing that by 5.4, which takes megajoules of energy to produce a litre of milk, potential loss of milk production would be around 9,000 litres. Live weight gain around 900 megajoules of energy for sort of a steer between 300 and 400 kgs. So that sort of animal would need around 900 megajoules of energy to produce a kg of live weight gain. So we're losing approximately 540 kgs of live weight gain per hectare by that loss of 48,000 megajoules of energy between the two lays. To replace that with a concentrate, well, concentrate feed, a good quality concentrate feed at the moment is around that £250 with an ME of 13. So that gives us 1.9p per megajoule of energy. And to replace that, therefore, that 48,000 with concentrate feed would cost us £925. Typically, you can see on the bottom line, that's a fairly typical permanent pasture seen in the John Nix Management Handbook and various other places, around 7 tonnes of dry matter at 10.5 ME. So the output in terms of energy from that field would be around 73 to 74,000 megajoules of energy per hectare. And you can see the difference in the loss of milk production, the loss in live weight gain, and the subsequent cost to actually buy that energy in to feed it instead. So the cost of reseeding can be recovered in several times over within the first full season after reseeding. So now I just want to talk through the some of the methods and timing and the pros and cons of the different methods and timing. So, well, where do you start? Well, ideally, you'd be regularly walking fields, and that includes silage ground as well as grazing ground, and recording your grass growth yields, whether that's either by plate meter or grazing days or live stocking rates, or silage trailer loads. And some of the modern forage harvesting equipment actually tells you what the output from each field is. So from that information, you'll be able to select fields that are underperforming, and then we can go and check the reasons and start to plan the improvements. Make sure always in the first instance that you've got a soil test, either taken in the autumn or maybe a regular part of a regular soil testing process. But ideally, those soil tests are done in the autumn, several months after any nutrient applications. At the same time, we're going to make a surface assessment to just see what the soil looks like. If we think we've got any issues, then that's when we start digging holes to see where the problems are, checking if there's been any underlying issues with waterness, with water lying there, or check if there's any unevenness, and see if there are any other underlying issues. If you haven't done it already, it's worth scoring your soil. So you're looking for a nice uniform texture throughout that layer, and check to see if there are any pans or limiting layers, and how deep they are and how they can be rectified later on. On the left-hand side, you can see there what ryegrass looks like, although I'm sure you already know we've got that red base to the bottom of the tiller. And in the case of perennial ryegrass, we've got folded leaves in the tiller, and the dark, shiny underneath side to the leaf there, top sort of slightly ribbed. In a nice fertile soil where we've got a good pH and P and K, perennial ryegrass is going to be the one that will produce the early growth. It's going to be better quality, and also it's going to be the most efficient at N utilisation. So when we're walking the field, check what the sown species are, and when you get your eye on what the sort of content remains. So shorter term lays, we're looking really for around 75% of sown species. Maybe longer term lays could be 60% or even a little bit higher. We're checking also when we're walking these swards, we're checking for ground cover. So how open does the lay look? How much soil can we see through it? And how dense is the bottom layer? And just check for any sort of thatch. So that surface layer will be crucial to the operation we might select. It's also an opportunity to have a look at drainage to see if there's any remedial work needs to be done with the drainage. And there will obviously sometimes be quite a variation from region to region, let alone different fields on one farm. If you don't already have a regular reseeding program, just to say it's not necessarily about starting with the most difficult field. If you find somewhere where we can improve your output, it's not always, as I say, the most difficult field, and you probably know which one that is. Choose a field that's going to be successful and the easiest to achieve a good result from. That might in the first instance be weed control, soil fertility, soil pH and structure. And then just by sort of making a start there, you would start to improve your output. That starts to take less pressure off overall yield because we're starting to grow a little bit more, and then we can gradually find a way to commit to a reseed. It might be using a break crop for summer grazing. So there should be opportunities out there to start to introduce a reseeding program if you aren't already. Spring, obviously things very influenced by the weather, and we know what's happening to the weather at this precise moment with the drought, as Kat's just said. Spring can lead to more successful establishment with wider sowing window and opportunities for post-emergence weed control if necessary. It's also a great opportunity to reseed by undersowing a spring cereal. Other than annual species such as Westerwald, there's not going to be any seed heads in the first year, so potentially there's slightly lower yield. Weed control in annual weeds, well, we'd hope the annual weeds would start to die out, and if we get a good job on that reseed, there won't be, they won't create too much competition to interfere with grass tillering and taking light and nutrients away from the reseed. So as long as they're a small in minority of the annual weeds, then they'll get grazed or they'll get mown out very soon. It's the perennial weeds, the very small perennial weeds that you need to be careful of, that we might need to deal with. It's also an opportunity to maybe use a break crop such as a brassica for summer grazing, and maybe even into autumn and winter grazing this year. And obviously brassicas make a great break crop because we have nothing that we can use now for soil pests such as leather jackets, so they make an ideal break crop. So spring reseeding can work very well in grazing rotations to a time when we're reaching peak growth. There's going to be less impact on available grazing areas, so rather than taking that field for silage when we've reached peak growth, it can be taken out for a reseed. And generally, if it's well done within a couple of months, a couple of rotations, we should have that laid back into the grazing rotation. Now, so the potential for reseeding in the spring, therefore, sort of around the April to May time, we can be back into grazing by June and July. So the downside perhaps is just the slightly lower yields overall, and in that first year, which will catch up the following year. And then depending on the method, we do need to be a little bit careful that we're not creating too tender a surface layer to travel or graze later on. Autumn reseeding, well, we're really talking about anything sort of post-harvest, so that might be end of July, it could be earlier this year, through to early August and onwards. And hopefully you've identified the fields by then that are underperforming and we're all ready to go, and we've got a plan in place. The benefit really of autumn reseeding is that the following year we're straight into the full production potential of that sward. And with grass lays, that's usually around 25% higher in the first year. So last autumn, when it was really wet, a lot of people just ran out of time. Grass seeds and other crops were left into sort of some quite difficult soils, and they were sodden over winter. But generally speaking, the seedbed over winter will get a good chance to settle down, and then we can start to travel on it, you know, easily the following year. The break crop in the autumn might be a cereal, or as long as it's early or mid-August, it could even be a late sown brassica. It could be useful this year to help out wintering cattle, because there's obviously going to be a pressure on forage stocks. It's a chance to deal with any soil issues that we might have, you know, by autumn reseeding, the same as it would do with spring reseeding. There should normally be less weed pressure in the autumn. That depends very much on you know, the method and particular field conditions. But choosing a timing to suit your system really, and your rotation and your you know, your particular field. There's not a right or wrong time. It depends entirely on what's happening on your, you know, on your system. But sort of, we've already said, the last couple of years we've seen perhaps you know, the conditions, the drought and then the wet weather, a lot of the older lays have fallen below the required productivity levels. So if it's looking like an early harvest this year, it could be time to cut your losses and plan your reseed for early autumn or late summer at least. So in terms of the different methods, there's work that shows the yield comparison between the different reseeding methods, and there is actually very little difference in the yield output following in the following full year when you're comparing ploughing with direct drilling and min-till reseeding operations. So provided they're well done and well managed post drilling, they can all be successful and result in excellent reseeds and good new plant populations. So when we say ploughing, it's obviously the intention to destroy the old sward and all the old species, whether that's with glyphosate or not. It does allow us to deal with all the perennial weeds. It buries that rotting layer, which then slowly reduces N back into the seed bed. It's an opportunity to break up any soil pans, and we can be burying any muck or slurry. It also enables us to lime straight on the plough and then work it into the surface. The important thing is to achieve this uniform and fine and firm level seedbed that allows us a nice shallow and consistent sowing depth. So the right technique is going to depend very much on your own conditions and your own farm. We can't stress enough this fine and firm seedbed and shallow drilling. The downside is potentially you're inverting a deeper soil that may be less fertile that you're bringing to the surface. It can disturb a weed bank, seed bank of weeds, which you know, the one old plant breeder quoted me 100,000 weed seeds per square metre of soil that have have developed over decades and decades and decades to live in that particular location. So as soon as we break the soil, you're breaking an opportunity for those weed seeds to chit. So it's important that we try and outcompete those very early on. Ploughing is obviously a more costly exercise, as we've seen earlier, and in drier situations it can tend to dry soils out if we're not a little bit careful on the timing and how we actually do it. The min-till operations, well, there are many different types of drill on the market for grass seed now, and they're all, you know, have their own particular method, and some of them are very well, most of them are very effective if they're used in the right way at the right time. So lots of opportunities there. In the right place, yeah, they all achieve excellent results, particularly probably in the spring. Obviously, they're going to work very well in the grazing rotations with or without glyphosate and minimal disturbance. They can get their swards back into rotation very quickly. Typically, those sorts of lays might be sprayed off, grazed down tightly, and then direct drilled, perhaps top dressed with N and possibly some of the fast-acting lime to neutralise that local acidity in the surface, and could be caused also by the rotting layer and N applications as well. So min-tills, they're going to work very well to introduce break crops such as brassicas. It helps clean up the old field. Can also work particularly well on some shallow soils and stony soils. So we're just working with that nice shallow top soil layer. Quicker to return to grazing, it's very much cheaper. The thing to be aware of here is that that top layer, it can be quite difficult, and there can be quite a thick layer of trash, and we need to make sure that we've dealt with any thatch that, you know, will inhibit the new seedlings. Now, overseeding can be variable results with overseeding. The key really is to make sure that there's a sufficient open space, and provided there is still a good percentage of your sown species present, overseeding can be an option. It can be successful. Ideally, sort any weeds out first of all. After an appropriate time, then you would oversow the new seed, and it can be an effective way to introduce clover by grazing down hard and sowing in the seed, and then maintaining grazing pressure, maybe on-off grazing pressure a week or two. Overseeding generally is more successful with larger seeded varieties, which are tetraploids, and obviously there's very little damage here to the existing swards. We just have to be careful there isn't too much competition from the existing seed species, and as we've said, we're looking at using larger seeded varieties there, which may not always be the varieties or the species you're trying to introduce into your sward. Really, you know, there's not a right or wrong way. It's whichever way works best according to your conditions. There can be little difference sometimes in the output, comparing ploughing with direct drilling and min-tilling. Done correctly, they can all be successful on your farm. Mixture selection. So the first question really is, well, why are we using a mixture? So experiments have actually shown that mixtures don't necessarily yield more than straights. In fact, the annual yields are often comparable, although that single variety can be very high yielding, but it may not be the following season a very high yielding variety. It may have an underlying trait in a mixture that wouldn't be a risk. So mixtures really give us a consistency. They give us that good yield every year, and they reduce risk. Some grassland managers use very simple mixtures of maybe no more than 2 or 3 varieties, which have been carefully selected and well managed. They achieve excellent output. But as a rule, in the vast majority of cases, a well-balanced mixture that fits your purpose is going to be the best solution. But a mixture shouldn't be an opportunity to dilute the overall quality and requirements of the mixture. Every variety within that mixture should count. So what do we need to consider? Well, very carefully what your field is to be used for the entire season. Is it an intensive cutting as many times as possible, possibly tolerating sheep in the winter, or is it purely grazing and only mown when necessary, when we need to ensile the grass that we have in surplus? Or is it a more traditional, robust, dual-purpose mixture that's got to do a little bit of everything? And the big thing, of course, to consider is your persistency, the longevity. How long does that need to last for? So the species we'd be using, obviously Italians and hybrids. Italians lasting 2 years, very strong spring growth, very responsive to nitrogen. They're ideal for our short-term silage lays. Hybrid ryegrasses, a cross between Italian and perennial, 3 years plus, similar to Italians, shorter and more medium-term lays, but mainly cutting. And then perennial ryegrass, say 4 years plus in the early, intermediate and late heading groups. They're more persistent. We've got better seasonal growth, sort of mid and late season growth and quality. They suit the medium and the longer term lays, both grazing and for cutting. We have other species such as Festuloliums, which is a cross between a ryegrass and a fescue. And then obviously Timothy in wetter, cooler climates. It's very palatable. It's good mid-season growth, and it might be used more in the uplands, or I say in those wetter, colder soils, and particularly perhaps with beef and sheep. Cocksfoot, suitable in lighter ground, really. It has that big, robust root. It's palatable when it's a young plant, but it can get very tufty, and it takes different management, or it takes some careful management, I should say. So ploidy, or ploidy, we mean diploids and tetraploids for all the ryegrasses. And diploids, quite simply, that's 2 sets of chromosomes. Tetraploids, 4 sets of chromosomes. So diploids tend to be denser, slightly drier, slightly higher dry matter, and we get better ground cover. Tetraploids, so that slightly bigger plant cell. There are fewer tillers. It's more erect in its growth habit, and it tends to be slightly sort of broader leaf. So, and then when it comes to variety, well, there are differences, varietal differences within all the species. We just need to think carefully about which traits are going to be the most important in your system. Is it just purely yield and short-term yield, or has it got to be combined with quality and consistency? So thinking carefully about how many times you want to mow, considering maybe heading dates, depending on where you are. What time do you usually mow? Heading dates are quite crucial. And when is the most grazing pressure? When is the grazing required on your farm? Is it midsummer? Is it late season? Is it spring? And will it winter hard enough to cope with your land? So looking at grazing mixtures here, so prerequisites for grazing mixtures, there's a list of qualities there, or list of traits, quality, dry matter, persistence, heading date, and so on. And those are ranked in order that are considered to be the most important, not only by us and the farmers that we talk to, but an HDB did a survey, and they rank the grazing priorities in that order as well. So species that suit those priorities, predominantly diploid, will give you that grazing quality and yield. White clover, tetraploid also, but maybe to a lesser extent, and then Timothy and cocksfoot. And nowadays we're seeing a lot more use of herbs, so plantain and chicory, and maybe some of the other herbs as well. So diploid is going to give us a better ground cover, and we'll cope probably better with wetter fields. There'll be more tillers per plant, so you get that resistance to poaching, and we get the density that we're looking for to give us the ground cover in grazing lays. This is an experiment that's carried out in Northern Ireland. There was a range of mixtures with a range of varieties and a range of heading dates within that mixture. This is simulated grazing management here to record the yields. So across the bottom, you can see the heading date range of the mixtures. We've got 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20. And then in the left-hand axis, you can see the vertical axis, you can see the difference in yield. So when you look at the red curve, you can see actually that there's not a massive loss of yield. You go from, what, 100 kgs down to around 100, 150. So the difference in that heading date range is only around 300, 350 kgs. But it does start to drop off. Once you get past 10 days there, the yield does start to drop off. But in overall yield, there's say not a huge effect. The thing that does happen when you've got that very wide heading date range is it makes it much more difficult to manage, because you're going to get a lot of ear emergence. So though the yield isn't a big factor, it is the quality that will drop off as the plants come into ear. As the plants are flowering, it makes it far more difficult to manage, and there would be a loss in quality. So looking now at cutting priorities, heading date's more crucial. We'll show you why. Quality and yield are obviously important, and as is the duration and persistency. That's down to how you want that, how long you want that lay to last. So Italians, as we've already said, a couple of years, mainly cutting. Hybrids, ryegrass, sort of 3-year lays. Tetraploids have excellent conservation yields and quality. and then diploids. The longer the layer's got to be down for, so it would increase the percentage of diploids. By the time we get to something that's got to last 4 years or more, particularly if it's, say in this instance, it's multiple cuts, we'd be looking by then at a blend of around 50% diploid to tetraploid of perennial ryegrass. Dual purpose, longer term mixtures, we'd be looking at probably reducing the tetraploid content round to that 30–35%, and the balance is made up with with diploid. Red clover for cutting more so than white clover, although we would be looking perhaps at using the larger leaved white clover in longer term dual purpose type lays. I've missed out Westerwald here as a species, but they're really only an annual crop, occasionally mixed with Italians just to just to give it a little bit more persistency and quality and winter hardiness. Same experiment in Northern Ireland. Looked at the different mixtures, different heading date range. So we've got the same heading date range along the bottom here, 5, 10, 15 and 20. And you can see this time on the vertical axis, you've got the actual range in yield. Once the heading date starts to get wider than around sort of 7 days, you've got a range in yield here of over 1.3 tonnes per hectare. So it does start to become quite significant. So your ideal heading date range for silage, for mowing, for cutting mixtures, will be around that 7 days at the very maximum. So yeah, 5 to 7 days is your optimum heading date range for cutting mixtures. Now, just to sort of summarize, really, you need to consider very carefully what and for how long your lay is going to be used for. We have the recommended list, both the English and Welsh list here, and there's one in Ireland, we have the PPI, and in Scotland there is also a list. So varieties, to get onto that recommended list, they have to show an improvement to displace another variety. There are constant improvements to the list. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a yield increase of nearly 10% and an increase in quality of around 5%. They're also getting better disease resistance. So selecting varieties from the recommended list with the traits that suit your system, that are going to be important to you, but always don't compromise on quality, we would say. And then regular seeding, as we've already said, really, regular reseeding is going to be the best return on investment available to livestock farmers. So thank you very much, everybody. And yes, thank you for listening, and we'll hope to hear from you again soon. Thank you.